Imagine a world with no bakeries, no ovens or flour sitting on a shelf, no sandwiches, toast, or birthday cake. For most of human history, that was simply reality. And yet today, some version of bread exists in nearly every culture on Earth, but baked in 1,000 different shapes, from a flat disc cooked on a hot stone to a soft loaf,
Air-filled loaf pulled from a modern oven.
So where did this all begin? Who looked at a wild side, grass seed, and somehow saw bread hiding inside it? The surprising answer is that bread is older than farming itself, older than pottery, older, in some sense, than settled human life as we usually picture it. For most of human history, people didn't grow, eat their own food at all. They followed it, moving with the seasons, gathering wild plants, hunting animals, never staying anywhere long enough to plant a crop and wait for it to grow. Grains existed in this world too, wild wheat, wild barley, growing in scattered patches across the landscape, but they weren't crops in any modern sense. So how do you turn a handful of tough, dry, wild seeds into something you can actually eat? This is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Archaeological evidence recovered from a site called Shubaika 1 in what is now Jordan includes charred food remains dated to roughly 14,400 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture existed anywhere in the region. Researchers examining these remains identified them as the burnt remnants of a flatbread-like food, made from ground wild cereals and club-rush tubers, mixed with water and cooked over a fire. In other words, hunter-gatherers, people with no farms, no domesticated wheat, no permanent villages, appear to have already been making something that looks remarkably like bread. If people were already making bread before farming existed, why did anyone bother inventing agriculture at all? The answer comes down to a simple, brutal problem. Wild grain wasn't reliable. It grew in scattered patches, ripened briefly, and had to be found and gathered by hand, season after season, with no guarantee any single patch would still be there, or fruitful, the following each year. Grinding it into something edible was hard, physical work too. A wild grain seed had to be crushed between two stones, over and over, just to break it down into something close to flour, an exhausting task that could occupy hours of a person's day for a relatively small amount of food in return. So people began doing something that would eventually change everything. Instead of only gathering wild grain wherever it happened to grow, they started deliberately planting it, tending it, and harvesting it in the same place, year after year. Over many generations, through both deliberate selection and unintentional pressure from harvesting methods, and the plants themselves began to change, favoring characteristics like seeds that stayed attached to the plant instead of scattering to the wind, making the crop easier to gather in bulk. This is the shift researchers refer to as domestication, and it turned an unpredictable wild resource into something communities could depend on season after season. It also tied people to the land in a way gathering never had. A family that planted a field in spring had a reason to still be standing in that same spot come harvest. Something that would have felt almost unthinkable to earlier generations who simply followed the food wherever it happened to grow. Now that a reliable source of grain existed, a new problem took its place. How do you turn a growing pile of harvested grain into something a whole community can actually eat day after day? This is where the grinding stone becomes one of the most important tools in early human history, even though it rarely gets remembered that way.
Early communities relied on what's often called a saddle quern, a large, flat stone base paired with a smaller handheld stone, dragged back.
Labor in many ancient societies, based on skeletal evidence, showing distinctive wear patterns linked to this repetitive motion. But it worked, transforming raw grain into something that could be mixed with water, shaped by hand, and cooked, and cooked.
And once that dough existed, the simplest possible method of cooking it was already sitting right there in front of every hearth. Flatten the dough and lay it directly onto a hot stone or the heated wall of a simple clay oven. This is almost certainly how the earliest breads were made for the
Thousands of years, flat, unleavened, cooked quickly, eaten the same day. Simple, reliable, but also, in a very real sense,
still missing something. Because at some point, someone left dough sitting out a little too long.
And what they found when they came back would change bread forever. Flour and water.
Left exposed to open air for any length of time, will naturally begin to attract wild yeast and bacteria drifting invisibly through the environment. Given enough time, that mixture starts to bubble, to rise, to change texture entirely. Nobody could have understood the biology behind it. Microscopic organisms feeding on the starches and releasing gas as a byproduct. But they could absolutely see and taste the result. Dough that had been left standing rose higher, baked lighter, and tasted noticeably different from anything made fresh the same day. And once someone noticed that difference, the logical next step wasn't hard to imagine. Saving back a small piece of that active is widely credited with some of the earliest strong evidence of this discovery being deliberately harnessed rather than stumbled into by accident. Egyptian bread making and beer brewing appear to have been closely linked activities, both relying on demonity fermentation, and it's likely that the same wild yeasts moving between bakeries and breweries played a role in both. Archaeological finds from ancient Egypt include specialized conical bread molds and tomb paintings depicting bakers kneading dough, shaping loaves, and tending
Ovens, suggesting bread production had become organized and skilled labor, not just a household task. But if leavened,
dough baked better in an enclosed space than directly on an open stone, that raised an obvious new question. How do you build something that traps heat evenly all the way around the dough instead of just scorching one side of it? The answer took shape in the form of the enclosed clay oven, sometimes referred to by the general term tanur in the ancient Near East, a rounded, dome-like structure built from clay, heated from within, with dough slapped directly against its hot inner walls to bake. This design solved a problem the open hot stone method never could: even, consistent dough on nearly every side, producing bread that rose more evenly and baked more thoroughly than anything cooked on a flat, exposed surface. With reliable grain, functioning mills, an understanding of fermentation, and ovens built specifically for the job, bread stopped being just food. It became something closer to infrastructure. In ancient Egypt, bread functioned as a form of currency in its own right. Laborers working on major state projects, including the very construction, crews responsible for building monumental structures like the pyramids, were regularly paid and been paid in rations of bread and beer.
Evidence that this staple food had become deeply woven into the basic economic structure of the society, not simply something eaten at
home. Large-scale, state-organized bakeries appear to have existed specifically to produce bread at the volume required to feed these enormous labor forces. But it was in ancient Rome, centuries later, where bread-making scaled into something resembling genuine industry. Roman bakers, known as pistores, formed organized professional guilds, and baking itself became a respected, specialized trade, rather than something handled purely at home. Archaeological evidence, including the remains of bakeries excavated at sites like Pompeii, reveals large stone mills, several of them together in a single building, powered by donkeys or horses walking in constant circles to grind flour at a scale no household quern could ever match. Bread had moved out of the family kitchen entirely and into something closer to a small factory, with dedicated grinding rooms, dedicated ovens, and workers whose entire livelihood depended on producing loaves for people they would never personally meet. Rome went even further, developing state-subsidized grain and bread distribution for its urban population, a system historians often refer to as the grain dole, an early example of food distribution organized directly by government policy, aimed at keeping the population of a sprawling capital city consistently fed. So think about the full distance this story travels. A wild grass seed, gathered by hand and crushed between two stones by people who had never planted a single crop. A domesticated grain, deliberately grown, harvested, and stored season after season. A lump of dough, left out by accident, and transformed by invisible organisms nobody could see or explain. A dome-shaped clay oven, engineered specifically to trap heat evenly around rising dough. And eventually, entire industries, donkey-powered mills, professional bakers' guilds, government, subsidized bread lines, feeding tens of thousands of people in cities that could never have grown so large, without a reliable, mass-produced food source at their core. None of this happened all at once, and none of it happened because one person somewhere had a single flash of genius. It happened because, over thousands of years, in more than one region entirely, people kept running into the same basic problem: how to turn a handful of hard, inedible seeds into something a body could actually use, and kept finding slightly better answers. 1. Generation quietly building on whatever the last one had already figured out. Today, walking into a bakery and picking up a 13 decision the tarts, soft, warm loaf feels almost entirely unremarkable. But that loaf carries an unbroken thread stretching back to hunter-gatherers, crouched beside an open fire, grinding wild seeds between two stones, thousands of years before anyone had ever planted a single crop on purpose. And maybe that's the real story hiding inside something as ordinary as a piece of bread.
Some of humanity's most essential inventions weren't dramatic, sudden breakthroughs at all. They were slow, patient answers to a very simple
question, repeated by countless hands across thousands of years, until something as basic as crushed grain and water quietly became one of the most important foods in human history. Imagine living your entire life without a country, no passport, no national flag, no government building, no border, no king telling you what territory belongs to him. For most of human history, that was completely normal. Humans created the very first cities, ruled by powerful, dynamic leaders, backed by massive, organized armies, controlling vast new territories. The surprising answer is that nobody invented a country. It emerged piece by piece, one small change layered on top of another. This transformation happened so slowly that no single person alive at the time could have actually seen the whole change, stretching across countless generations.
The transformation happened gradually. Small communities growing into farming villages growing into...
From the first cities, powerful rulers emerged. These leaders soon presided over vast states, which ultimately expanded into great empires. It's worth being clear from the start about what these early states actually were. They weren't modern countries, in any sense we'd recognize today. There were no passports, no citizenship papers,
no lines drawn neatly on a map, no customs officers checking who was allowed to cross a border.
What they had instead was something simpler, but genuinely powerful: centralized political institutions, controlling both people and territory. But before anyone could rule thousands of people, there had to be a reason for thousands of people to live together in the first place. Agriculture changed everything. Once humans began farming and keeping animals, something that had never really been what existed before became possible. This was the idea of permanence. Crops could be planted and harvested. Season after season, in the exact same location. This tied a single family to this patch of land, year after year. Food could be stored rather than consumed immediately, which meant a bad week no longer meant starvation. Houses could be built to last, instead of abandoned every few weeks in search of the next hunting ground. And as food supplies became more stable, populations could grow alongside them. It's important not to oversimplify this. Farming didn't automatically create countries. What it created were the conditions that eventually made larger, more complex societies possible. More people living closer together. And for the first time, more food than any single family actually needed right away. And once a village had more food than it needed immediately, someone had to decide what happened to that extra food. This is where large communities ran into a genuinely new kind of problem: coordination. Someone had to organize food storage, deciding how much grain got set aside for the lean months ahead. Someone had to manage irrigation systems kept crops alive. A poorly maintained canal could ruin the harvest for everyone. Someone had to direct the labor, land use, trade with neighboring settlements. Early administrative systems in Mesopotamia provide clear evidence of exactly this kind of organization. These were structures built specifically for production. Storage and redistribution, evidence of decisions being made and tracked, rather than left to chance. But once someone controls the food, the workers, and the land, something very important starts to happen. Power begins to concentrate. This is where the story becomes visually spectacular, and it centers on one place in particular, Uruk, in southern Mesopotamia. A settlement grew, slowly at first, then dramatically, into something genuinely new, a city. Monumental buildings rose where simple mud brick structures once stood. Specialized workers appeared, people whose entire role was no longer growing food, but crafting, building, administering. A shift that became possible once enough surplus food existed to support people who weren't directly farming it themselves. Uruk sits at the very center of urbanization and early state formation during what archaeologists call the Uruk period, roughly 3800 to 3300 BCE. The evidence is remarkably tangible: monumental architecture, dedicated administrative buildings, clay seals used to mark ownership, authority, and the movement of goods, and crucially, some of the earliest known writing, developed specifically to keep track of a society that had grown. Too large and too complex to manage from memory alone. But a city isn't automatically a country. Someone still had to convince thousands of people that one single authority actually had the right to rule over them. Political authority became visible in a way it never had before. Rulers and elites began directly controlling labor, resources, construction projects, warfare, and religious institutions all at once. Buildings this large and coordinated strongly suggest a society capable of organizing and directing large amounts of labor, a hierarchy where some people organized and commanded, and far more people worked. Religion played a real role here too. Temples and other public religious structures show just how closely political power and religious authority were intertwined in early Mesopotamia, rulers presenting their control not as personal ambition, but as part of a much larger sacred order, as though obeying the ruler and honoring the gods were simply two sides of the same obligation. Still, it would be a mistake to claim religion invented government.
It was one thread among several, woven into something considerably more complicated. And then something changed.
These cities stopped simply organizing themselves internally and started competing directly with the cities next door. Early Mesopotamia was never one single peaceful country stretching across the region. It was a landscape of competing city-states, each with its own rulers, its own institutions, its own ambitions. Uruk, Kish. Each of these cities developed genuine political structures of their own, and each competed fiercely for land and resources with its neighbors. Historians studying this period describe it precisely this way:
The early dynastic period.
as an era defined by rival city-states locked in ongoing competition for control of the irrigated farmland that all of them depended on to survive. Walls rose around cities not for decoration, but out of necessity, a visible sign of just how real that competition had become.
And if one city could defeat another in that competition, its ruler suddenly controlled.
Instead of one city simply governing its own immediate surroundings, certain rulers began extending in control across the
multiple cities and territories at once. Sargon of Akkad stands as one of the clearest examples of this shift, traditionally associated with
the Akkadian Empire around the 24th century BCE. His political reach extended well beyond a single city's walls, an early, dramatic example of the same basic progression repeating itself: city to city-state, to a network of multiple cities, to kingdom, and finally, to empire. But conquering territory was only ever half the problem. How do you actually maintain control over people living hundreds of kilometers away from you, people who never see you, who owe you no personal loyalty at all? This is where the idea of a country genuinely starts becoming a functioning system rather than just a claim of authority.
A ruler controlling distant territory needed administrators to represent that authority locally, standing in for a ruler most ordinary.
People would never actually meet, officials to carry out decisions, soldiers to enforce them when necessary, systems of taxation,
Or tribute to fund it all, because armies, officials, and monumental buildings didn't pay for themselves. Record keepers to track what
was owed, what was produced, and what had already been collected. Written administrative records recovered from Mesopotamia reveal increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic systems handling exactly these kinds of demands. Recent archaeological work on the Girsu archives has revealed something genuinely striking: the extraordinary scale of Akkadian administrative record-keeping, meticulously organized more than 4,000 years ago, long before anyone could have imagined a filing cabinet or a spreadsheet. The first countries, in other words, weren't held together by borders drawn on a map. They were held together by people, records, and the creation of states wasn't something unique to Mesopotamia alone. Similar transformations, villages growing into cities producing centralized authority, unfolded independently in several other regions entirely: Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, places separated by vast distances, oceans, and mountain ranges. With these state-forming processes developing, researchers studying what's known as primary state formation have identified multiple, genuinely independent cases of this exact process occurring across the ancient world, separated by oceans, mountains, and centuries, with no possible contact between them. So if nobody invented the first country, why did this same fundamental transformation happen? Again and again, in completely unconnected parts of the world?
There was never a single moment where
Someone decided, let's invent a country. Instead, the process unfolded in layers, each one only becoming possible once the layer beneath it was. This was already in place. People settled into permanent communities. Food accumulated beyond immediate need. Populations grew alongside that surplus. Cities emerged from those growing populations. Someone stepped in to organize the resources those cities depended on. Power gradually concentrated around whoever controlled that organization. Cities began competing with each other for land and resources. Successful rulers conquered territory beyond their own city walls. Formal administrations developed to manage everything that conquest demanded.
And eventually, Out of all of that accumulated complexity, true kingdoms and empires took shape.
The first country wasn't invented in a single moment. It was built piece by piece, as humans slowly discovered that controlling a population, it required far more than simply having a ruler standing at the top. It required food, workers, records, laws, soldiers, territory, and an interconnected system capable of keeping thousands of strangers bound to the same central authority. Strangers who would never meet their ruler, never vote for him, and yet would still pay tribute, still fight in his wars, still obey his official. Today, a country feels almost obvious, something you're simply born into without a second thought. It has borders, flags, governments, passports, laws, a shared national identity binding millions of people who will never
Personally meet each other, and yet who feel, somehow, that they belong to the same thing. But none of that appeared overnight, and
none of it was ever the plan from the very beginning. It's the result of thousands of years of humans experimenting, sometimes clumsily, sometimes brilliantly, with how to organize large societies at all. The first countries weren't drawn onto maps. They were built out of villages, cities, food, power, and people. And once humans finally learned how to organize, thousands of strangers under a single authority, the world would never look the same again.
Imagine working, running, dancing, or farming all day, without a bra, without elastic, without modern fabric. Yet women did exactly that for thousands of years. So what actually kept everything in place? The answer isn't one invention. It's dozens of clever solutions, created independently by different civilizations, each one shaped by their own climate, clothing, and daily life. The modern bra, the kind sitting in your drawer right now, is surprisingly young in the grand scope of history. But breast support itself is ancient. Long before elastic, before factories, before a single fashion brand existed, women around the world were already solving this exact same problem, and remarkably, they solved it in very different ways. Some relied on wrapped cloth. Others built the support directly into their everyday clothing. And one civilization, as we'll see, may have been doing something surprisingly close to a modern solution, thousands of years earlier than anyone expected. To find the first clues, archaeologists have to travel back more than 3,500 years, to a civilization whose clothing still surprises historians today. The earliest evidence takes us back to Bronze Age Crete, home of the Minoan civilization. Among the most striking artifacts to survive from this culture are figurines known as the snake goddesses, women depicted wearing fitted, structured bodices that lift and frame the chest with unmistakable intention. This isn't loose draped fabric. It's tailored, shaped clothing, engineered around the body rather than simply hanging from it. It's worth being precise here. Historians interpret these bodices as an early form of breast support based on how deliberately they're shaped in the surviving art and artifacts, but we're working from figurines and fragments, not a fully preserved garment, so this remains an archaeological interpretation rather than a confirmed, documented technique. Still, the surviving artwork suggests Minoan artisans deliberately designed these garments with structure and support in mind, although exactly how they were worn remains uncertain. But these garments looked nothing like what came next. Across the Aegean Sea, the Greeks chose a far simpler solution. A wrapped band of cloth called a strophion, sometimes referred to as an apodesmos. Rather than a shaped, structured piece, this was a long strip of fabric wound around the chest, offering support through simple, direct wrapping rather than tailoring. Evidence for this comes from two different directions: Greek vase paintings depicting women wearing the band, and literary references describing its use, giving historians a reasonably clear picture of how common and how functional this simple technique actually was. Rome inherited the idea, but adapted it. Rome's version of this wrapped band shows up vividly in one of the most famous surviving mosaics from the ancient world, the so-called Bikini Girls mosaic, found in a Roman villa in Sicily, depicting women engaged in athletic activity while wearing chest-supporting bands. Roman writers also describe garments known as the strophium and mammillare, used to bind or support the chest, essentially a Roman approach to what we might now recognize as sports-specific support. This wasn't just about modesty. It was function, built specifically for movement, for exercise, for activity that a loose garment simply couldn't accommodate. But not every civilization relied on separate garments at all. Elsewhere, support came from clothing itself. In many cultures across history, breast support wasn't a distinct item you put on. It was built directly into the clothing itself. Fitted tunics, cinched belts, tailored bodices, garments constructed and adjusted specifically to hold their shape against the body. Instead of adding a separate supportive layer, tailoring itself did the work, shaping the fabric so precisely that no additional undergarment was needed. It's a completely different philosophy from the wrapped band or structured bodice, support through the cut of the clothing rather than through a dedicated piece worn underneath it. Then, centuries later, archaeologists uncovered something no one expected. At Langberg Castle in Austria, researchers uncovered a hoard of textile fragments dating back centuries, and among them were linen garments that resembled certain features of a modern bra, complete with distinct cups and supportive structure. This find genuinely surprised historians. The long-standing assumption had been that structured, cup-based breast support simply didn't exist in medieval Europe, that women relied entirely on shaping through outer garments during this period. The Langberg discovery challenged that assumption, suggesting that some medieval women may have worn garments functionally similar to a modern bra hundreds of years earlier than historians once believed. It's an extraordinary find, and one that continues to reshape how historians think about this entire timeline. But one famous ancient civilization seems to have done something completely different. In ancient Egypt, the evidence for a dedicated, separate breast support garment is notably thin. Instead, Egyptian clothing relied heavily on lightweight linen, fitted closely to the body, well suited to an intensely hot climate where heavier, layered garments simply weren't practical. Rather than adding a distinct supportive layer, the fitted cut of Egyptian dresses appears to have served that role on its own, much like the tailored clothing approach seen elsewhere. Whether this reflects a genuine absence of separate support garments, or simply a gap in what has survived archaeologically after thousands of years, historians can't say with certainty. What the evidence does show clearly is that Egypt's solution, whatever it fully looked like, was shaped directly by its climate and its clothing traditions. So if civilization after civilization solved the same basic problem in such different ways, what does that actually tell us? There was never one single ancient bra, no shared blueprint passed down and refined generation after generation. Instead, each civilization adapted breast support to its own climate, its own clothing traditions, its own culture, and the specific demands of daily work and movement. Minoan Crete built structure directly into a bodice. Greece wrapped a simple band. Rome adapted that band for athletic activity. Elsewhere, tailoring alone did the job. And in one Austrian castle, a discovery emerged that looked startlingly close to something modern, centuries before anyone expected it to exist. The modern bra represents the latest stage in a much longer history of breast support. For thousands of years, women didn't wait for modern fashion to solve everyday problems. Using woven cloth, carefully tailored clothing, and practical design, they found solutions that worked for their own lives. The bra hanging in your closet today isn't the beginning of this story, it's simply the newest chapter in a history of ingenuity that stretches back thousands of years. Long before elastic, factories, or fashion brands, women were already solving the same everyday challenge in remarkably creative ways. Imagine working, running, dancing, or farming all day, without a bra, without elastic, without modern fabric. Yet women did exactly that for thousands of years. So what actually kept everything in place? The answer isn't one invention. It's dozens of clever solutions, created independently by different civilizations, each one shaped by their own climate, clothing, and daily life. The modern bra, the kind sitting in your drawer right now, is surprisingly young in the grand scope of history. But breast support itself is ancient. Long before elastic, before factories, before a single fashion brand existed, women around the world were already solving this exact same problem, and remarkably, they solved it in very different ways. Some relied on wrapped cloth. Others built the support directly into their everyday clothing. And one civilization, as we'll see, may have been doing something surprisingly close to a modern solution, thousands of years earlier than anyone expected. To find the first clues, archaeologists have to travel back more than 3,500 years, to a civilization whose clothing still surprises historians today. The earliest evidence takes us back to Bronze Age Crete, home of the Minoan civilization. Among the most striking artifacts to survive from this culture are figurines known as the snake goddesses, women depicted wearing fitted, structured bodices that lift and frame the chest with unmistakable intention. This isn't loose draped fabric. It's tailored, shaped clothing, engineered around the body rather than simply hanging from it. It's worth being precise here. Historians interpret these bodices as an early form of breast support based on how deliberately they're shaped in the surviving art and artifacts, but we're working from figurines and fragments, not a fully preserved garment, so this remains an archaeological interpretation rather than a confirmed, documented technique. Still, the surviving artwork suggests Minoan artisans deliberately designed these garments with structure and support in mind, although exactly how they were worn remains uncertain. But these garments looked nothing like what came next. Across the Aegean Sea, the Greeks chose a far simpler solution. A wrapped band of cloth called a strophion, sometimes referred to as an apodesmos. Rather than a shaped, structured piece, this was a long strip of fabric wound around the chest, offering support through simple, direct wrapping rather than tailoring. Evidence for this comes from two different directions: Greek vase paintings depicting women wearing the band, and literary references describing its use, giving historians a reasonably clear picture of how common and how functional this simple technique actually was. Rome inherited the idea, but adapted it. Rome's version of this wrapped band shows up vividly in one of the most famous surviving mosaics from the ancient world, the so-called Bikini Girls mosaic, found in a Roman villa in Sicily, depicting women engaged in athletic activity while wearing chest-supporting bands. Roman writers also describe garments known as the strophium and mammillare, used to bind or support the chest, essentially a Roman approach to what we might now recognize as sports-specific support. This wasn't just about modesty. It was function, built specifically for movement, for exercise, for activity that a loose garment simply couldn't accommodate. But not every civilization relied on separate garments at all. Elsewhere, support came from clothing itself. In many cultures across history, breast support wasn't a distinct item you put on. It was built directly into the clothing itself. Fitted tunics, cinched belts, tailored bodices, garments constructed and adjusted specifically to hold their shape against the body. Instead of adding a separate supportive layer, tailoring itself did the work, shaping the fabric so precisely that no additional undergarment was needed. It's a completely different philosophy from the wrapped band or structured bodice, support through the cut of the clothing rather than through a dedicated piece worn underneath it. Then, centuries later, archaeologists uncovered something no one expected. At Langberg Castle in Austria, researchers uncovered a hoard of textile fragments dating back centuries, and among them were linen garments that resembled certain features of a modern bra, complete with distinct cups and supportive structure. This find genuinely surprised historians. The long-standing assumption had been that structured, cup-based breast support simply didn't exist in medieval Europe, that women relied entirely on shaping through outer garments during this period. The Langberg discovery challenged that assumption, suggesting that some medieval women may have worn garments functionally similar to a modern bra hundreds of years earlier than historians once believed. It's an extraordinary find, and one that continues to reshape how historians think about this entire timeline. But one famous ancient civilization seems to have done something completely different. In ancient Egypt, the evidence for a dedicated, separate breast support garment is notably thin. Instead, Egyptian clothing relied heavily on lightweight linen, fitted closely to the body, well suited to an intensely hot climate where heavier, layered garments simply weren't practical. Rather than adding a distinct supportive layer, the fitted cut of Egyptian dresses appears to have served that role on its own, much like the tailored clothing approach seen elsewhere. Whether this reflects a genuine absence of separate support garments, or simply a gap in what has survived archaeologically after thousands of years, historians can't say with certainty. What the evidence does show clearly is that Egypt's solution, whatever it fully looked like, was shaped directly by its climate and its clothing traditions. So if civilization after civilization solved the same basic problem in such different ways, what does that actually tell us? There was never one single ancient bra, no shared blueprint passed down and refined generation after generation. Instead, each civilization adapted breast support to its own climate, its own clothing traditions, its own culture, and the specific demands of daily work and movement. Minoan Crete built structure directly into a bodice. Greece wrapped a simple band. Rome adapted that band for athletic activity. Elsewhere, tailoring alone did the job. And in one Austrian castle, a discovery emerged that looked startlingly close to something modern, centuries before anyone expected it to exist. The modern bra represents the latest stage in a much longer history of breast support. For thousands of years, women didn't wait for modern fashion to solve everyday problems. Using woven cloth, carefully tailored clothing, and practical design, they found solutions that worked for their own lives. The bra hanging in your closet today isn't the beginning of this story, it's simply the newest chapter in a history of ingenuity that stretches back thousands of years. Long before elastic, factories, or fashion brands, women were already solving the same everyday challenge in remarkably creative ways. Imagine standing in front of a river with no bridge, no ferry, no motorboat, and no road across it. Water moving fast beneath a gray sky, the far bank close enough to see clearly but impossible to simply walk toward. Behind you is your home. On the other side is everything you need to reach. So how did ancient humans actually get across? They didn't have one solution. They had several. Modern people see a river and immediately think, bridge. Ancient people saw something different. They looked for the easiest place to cross, reading the water itself for weaknesses, places where the current slowed, where the bottom firmed up, where the river simply gave a little ground. Depth, current, the season, all of it mattered, and all of it could change within a single year, turning a safe crossing into a dangerous one and back again, a route usable in late summer that might be completely impassable after spring rains swelled the Seine River. And archaeological research from the Roman frontier shows that movement through a landscape was often strongly shaped by exactly where these crossing points sat, roads bending toward them rather than running in a straight line regardless of the water, engineers and travelers alike working with the river instead of against it. But what happened when the river was simply too deep to walk through? The ford was probably the simplest ancient river crossing of all. Instead of defeating the river, humans found its weakness, a shallow stretch, a firm riverbed, a slower current where people, animals, and eventually carts could make their way across. Picture it, a line of travelers wading through knee-deep water, feeling for solid ground with each step, animals pulling back nervously at the current before finally committing to the crossing. Use it enough times, and a natural ford could become something more than a crossing point. It could become a route, worn into the landscape by generation after generation of the same footsteps, the same hooves, the same wheels, a path etched into the earth by nothing more than repetition. It's worth pausing on something historians point out here. A ford leaves almost nothing behind. No stone structure, no monument, often no written record at all, just water flowing over the same shallow stretch it always has. Which means the archaeological record likely understates just how important fords actually were. Historians frequently have to reconstruct these ancient crossing points indirectly, by studying how roads, settlements, and terrain line up around a river, rather than finding the crossing itself, piecing together a picture from everything surrounding an absence. But a ford only worked when the water cooperated. What happened when it simply didn't? Long before bridges, humans already knew how to float. Boat building isn't a recent skill layered on top of ancient life, it's ancient itself, stretching back further than most people would ever assume. In Britain, archaeologists have recovered Bronze Age log boats known as the Ferriby boats, sophisticated enough in their construction to show real skill and planning behind them, not crude, hollowed-out logs thrown together in a hurry, but vessels shaped with deliberate craftsmanship, built to last and built to actually work on open water. More recently, excavations at Must Farm uncovered additional Bronze Age log boats, dated roughly 2,500 to 3,500 years old, offering direct evidence that prehistoric communities were actively using boats to move through wet, water-heavy landscapes as a normal part of daily life, not as some rare or exceptional event. But you didn't need a carefully built boat to cross a river. Sometimes all you needed was something that simply floated. A boat requires real construction, planning, tools, time, resources not every traveler had access to. A raft can be far simpler. Logs lashed together with whatever cord or vine was on hand. Bundles of reeds bound tight, buoyant enough to hold a person's weight above the current. Even inflated animal skins, stitched and sealed, buoyant enough to support a person or a small load across open water, a solution that required almost nothing but what a hunting trip had already provided. This is where the story runs into a genuine problem, not in what happened, but in what survived. Wood, reeds, and hide decay quickly, especially compared to a carved wooden boat left to rest undisturbed in mud or silt for thousands of years. Research into Egyptian rivercraft specifically highlights this exact issue. Humble, everyday rafts were often temporary, sometimes dismantled right after use, which means they're consistently underrepresented in what archaeology actually finds. Their absence from the record doesn't mean they were rare. It likely means the opposite. They were so common, so disposable, that almost nothing was left behind to prove it. But what if you didn't want to build anything at all, and needed to cross the same river again and again? Repeated crossings created a different kind of solution entirely. Don't cross the river yourself. Let a boat do the repeated work for you. ferries carried people, animals, and goods back and forth across the same fixed point, sometimes relying on poles, ropes, or the current itself to guide the crossing, a single vessel making the same short journey dozens of times in a single day. It's important to be careful here. Evidence for specific ancient ferry systems is harder to establish in many locations, and individual examples need to be treated with real caution rather than assumed universally. What we can say is that the underlying need, repeated, reliable movement across the same stretch of water, clearly existed, and ferries were one practical answer wherever conditions allowed it, turning a single crossing point into something closer to a fixed piece of daily infrastructure. For ordinary travelers, a ferry solved the problem well enough. But armies faced something else entirely. A few people crossing a river is one kind of challenge. An army is a completely different one. Picture thousands of soldiers, horses, loaded carts, weapons, and supplies, all needing to reach the opposite bank, often under real-time pressure, sometimes under threat, with an enemy potentially watching from the far side, waiting for exactly the moment when a crossing army would be at its most vulnerable, half on one bank and half on the other. Ancient military campaigns responded to this in several ways. Commanders searched for usable fords, sending scouts ahead specifically to locate them, sometimes days before the main force ever reached the water. They commandeered or built boats specifically for the crossing, whatever the local landscape and timeline allowed. And when neither option was fast enough or safe enough, they constructed temporary crossings altogether, engineered specifically for that single campaign and nothing beyond it. This is where river crossing stopped being a simple journey and became a genuine engineering problem, one that pushed ancient militaries toward increasingly sophisticated solutions, refined campaign after campaign, lessons carried forward from one river to the next. Before permanent bridges became widespread, engineers had already learned how to build something that worked just as well for the moment, then disappeared without a trace once its job was done. Wooden structures, raised quickly and just as quickly torn down. Boats lashed together to support a walkway, forming an early pontoon-style crossing that could carry an entire column of soldiers across in a single afternoon. Roman military engineering, in particular, became remarkably capable at this kind of rapid, temporary construction, built for a specific campaign, then dismantled or abandoned once it had served its purpose. It wasn't about permanence. It was about solving today's problem today, without wasting resources on a structure the army might never pass through again. But once humans learned how to turn a river crossing into a temporary road, something far bigger started to take shape. Crossing a river was never really just about reaching the other bank. Over time, these crossing points began shaping entire patterns of human life around them. Trade routes bent toward reliable fords and ferry points, merchants planning entire journeys around where the water could actually be crossed, sometimes adding days to a trip simply to reach a known, dependable crossing rather than risk an unfamiliar stretch of river. Settlements grew up specifically near dependable crossings, places where merchants, travelers, and soldiers all had to pass through, whether they wanted to or not, turning a simple ford into the anchor of an entire town, markets and inns clustering around a spot that started as nothing more than shallow water. Military strategy revolved around controlling these same locations, because whoever held the crossing effectively held the route itself, and with it, control over everything moving along that route, goods, messages, and armies alike. A single river could function as a barrier, a highway, and a source of life all at once, cutting the landscape in two while simultaneously feeding the fields and settlements built along its banks, both obstacle and lifeline in the exact same breath. So when did humans finally decide that simply finding a crossing wasn't enough, that they should build their own way across instead? The surprising answer is that the bridge wasn't the beginning of this story at all. It was the culmination of thousands of years of experimentation that came before it. First, humans walked through the water, at the ford, where the river itself allowed it, then they floated across it, in boats built to last, and in rafts built to be used once and forgotten, left to rot on a distant bank. Then they built something temporary, engineered for a single crossing, a single campaign, a single urgent need, torn down the moment it had served its purpose. And only after all of that, after fords, boats, rafts, ferries, and temporary military crossings had already been tested and refined for generations, did permanent bridges become widespread, built to outlast the very need that first inspired them, standing long after the people who built them were gone. For thousands of years, rivers separated communities, slowed armies, redirected roads, and challenged every traveler who reached their banks. But humans rarely accepted the obstacle as final. They searched for shallow water. They built boats. They tied logs together. They created ferries. They constructed temporary roads across open water, one campaign at a time, learning something new with every river they faced. And eventually, they built bridges that could stand for centuries, structures that made an entire history of fords, rafts, and hurried military crossings feel almost invisible beneath them. The next time you cross a bridge without thinking about it, remember what you're really crossing isn't just a river. You're crossing thousands of years of human ingenuity. Imagine going to the bathroom with no toilet paper, no tissues, no wet wipes, and no bidet. You finish, and then realize you have absolutely nothing designed for the job. So what did ancient humans actually use? The answers range from water and cloth to leaves, stones, and one surprisingly strange Roman invention. Yet the most famous ancient toilet cleaning tool may not have been what you think it was. Toilet paper feels like it's always existed, something so ordinary it barely registers as a product at all. Measured against the full span of human history, though, it's remarkably recent. For almost all of that history, toilet paper simply wasn't missing from people's lives, because the problem itself was being solved in dozens of different ways. Ancient humans reached for whatever their environment, their technology, and their culture actually made available to them. That answer looked completely different depending on where you lived. Someone near a river had options someone in a dry inland village never would. A wealthy household in a city had access to materials a rural farming family simply couldn't get. Climate, water, local plants, wealth, culture, all of it shaped the solution, and none of it produced a single universal method. Some of the earliest evidence for any of this comes from an object that looks completely useless, until you learn exactly where archaeologists found it. In ancient Greece, archaeologists digging through sites associated with public latrines have repeatedly uncovered something unexpected: small, broken fragments of pottery, worn smooth along their edges, scattered near stone seats built directly over channels of running water. These fragments are known as pessoi, and researchers have interpreted them as possible toilet cleaning implements, pieces of broken ceramic reused for a purpose their original makers never intended when they first shaped that pot on a wheel. It's worth being honest about what this evidence actually shows. Their exact purpose isn't fully settled. The location, right alongside toilet facilities, strongly suggests a connection to hygiene, but pottery fragments can end up in a lot of places for a lot of reasons. What can be said with more confidence is that ancient Greek sources describe people using materials like stones and pottery fragments alongside other natural materials, giving historians a broader picture even where a single artifact's purpose stays uncertain. The Greeks weren't the only civilization working on this problem, though. The Romans took their approach to sanitation considerably further. Rome's most famous tool in this story is the tricerium, and its design is almost jarringly simple: a natural sea sponge attached to the end of a stick. Roman literary sources connect this tool directly to communal latrines, public toilet spaces where rows of seats sat side by side over running water below, no partitions, no privacy, conversation carrying easily from one seat to the next, an image strange enough on its own without any embellishment. This is exactly where the story tends to get exaggerated online, so it's worth slowing down here. The popular claim is that everyone in a Roman latrine shared a single sponge, passed from person to person without a second thought. Historians actually debate the details considerably more than that. How these sponges were used, how they were cleaned between uses, and whether they were shared communally or kept somewhat individually, all of this remains genuinely uncertain. The honest version of this story doesn't need exaggeration. A sponge on a stick, used in a public toilet built over flowing water, is already a strange and memorable detail entirely on its own. A sponge wasn't available everywhere, of course. In plenty of places, the simplest solution was already flowing right beside the toilet. For many ancient societies, the answer to this entire problem was water. Rivers, basins, jars kept specifically for the purpose, whatever was locally available. This approach made the most practical sense in places where water was genuinely abundant, and Roman sanitation systems in particular sometimes provided direct water access built right into public facilities, part of the same engineering that carried water throughout an entire city. This wasn't a uniquely Roman idea either. Water-based cleaning traditions continued for centuries across large parts of Asia and the Middle East, long after the Roman Empire itself had faded from the map, a genuinely durable solution that outlasted the civilization most associated with early plumbing. Water solved the problem beautifully wherever it was close at hand. The question is what happened when a convenient source simply wasn't nearby at all. Depending on the landscape, people turned to whatever grew around them. Leaves, grass, moss, and other soft plant material could all serve the same basic purpose, gathered fresh from the immediate environment rather than manufactured or purchased. Here's where the archaeological record runs into a real limitation. Leaves, grass, and moss decompose relatively quickly, leaving little or no evidence for archaeologists thousands of years later. That means the physical evidence for this category of material is almost certainly far thinner than its actual historical use. The absence of preserved leaves in the archaeological record doesn't mean people weren't using them constantly. It likely just means the material itself was never built to last. Depending on the environment, people may have relied on this kind of natural material more than any pottery fragment or sponge ever suggests, simply because it was free, immediate, and required no manufacturing at all. And that's where the strangest part of the story begins, because sometimes the material used wasn't natural at all. In societies where textiles carried real value, worn-out cloth rarely went to waste. A garment that had reached the end of its useful life as clothing could still serve a household in other ways, torn down into scraps and repurposed for practical, everyday tasks around the home, from cleaning to padding to exactly this kind of personal hygiene. This needs a careful, precise framing, because it's easy to overstate. There isn't evidence that every ancient culture routinely used cloth specifically for this purpose. What the broader historical pattern does show is that textiles were valuable enough, and scarce enough in many economies, that almost nothing went to waste once a piece of fabric had outlived its original use. Wherever cloth scraps existed in a household, hygiene was simply one of many possible uses competing for that same limited resource. The real surprise isn't what people wiped with at all, though. It's how differently entire societies approached the broader idea of bathroom hygiene in the first place. Here's a detail that genuinely reframes the whole story. The absence of toilet paper never meant the absence of sanitation. Roman engineering, in particular, produced remarkably sophisticated systems around this exact problem: extensive public latrines, drainage channels running beneath entire neighborhoods, sewers connected to aqueduct-fed water supplies, organized infrastructure built specifically to move waste out of a city efficiently, engineering that wouldn't be matched again in much of Europe for well over 1,000 years. Rome wasn't alone here either. Other ancient societies independently developed their own drainage and waste management systems, tackling large-scale sanitation with real engineering skill, centuries before anything resembling modern plumbing existed anywhere in Europe. This reveals something important that's easy to miss. Sanitation technology and wiping technology were never actually the same problem. A civilization could build extraordinary sewers, elaborate public latrines, and citywide drainage, genuinely advanced infrastructure by any measure, while still relying on nothing more sophisticated than a handful of leaves or a shared sponge for the final, personal step. If ancient humans had multiple working solutions to this problem already, water, cloth, natural material, even engineered sanitation systems built around them, one question remains. Why did toilet paper eventually become the answer nearly everyone settled on? There was never one single ancient replacement for toilet paper, no universal method passed down and repeated identically across every culture and continent. Different societies solved this problem according to whatever surrounded them. Some relied on water, especially where rivers and plumbing made it the obvious, practical choice. Some very likely relied on natural materials like leaves and grass, even though that evidence rarely survives for archaeologists to find. Some used cloth, wherever textiles were available and worth stretching toward every possible use. Some left behind physical clues like the Greek pessoi, small fragments hinting at a purpose historians still can't confirm with total certainty. And the Romans engineered something stranger still, a sponge fixed to a stick, used within some of the most advanced public sanitation systems the ancient world ever built. The real lesson underneath all of this isn't about toilet paper at all. Toilet paper didn't make humans clean. Humans had already been solving this exact problem for thousands of years, using whatever intelligence and available material their world provided. Toilet paper was simply one particularly convenient solution that happened to become widespread much later than almost anyone assumes. Think about that small roll sitting in your bathroom right now. It looks completely unremarkable, something you'd never think twice about. Historically speaking, though, it represents an extremely recent answer to one of the oldest, most universal problems every human being has ever faced. For thousands of years, people had no product to reach for at all. They simply had to look at the world immediately around them and ask one plain, practical question: what can I actually use? The answer depended entirely on where they lived, what they had access to, and what their particular corner of civilization was able to provide. Before toilet paper became something we buy by the roll without a second thought, staying clean after using the toilet meant using whatever the world around you could provide. Imagine trying to make a sword without steel, without power tools, without a factory, and without even knowing what a sword is supposed to look like. All you have is a fire, some strange rocks pulled from the ground, and a piece of soft, dull metal. Yet somehow, ancient humans turned that into one of history's most iconic weapons. So how did they actually do it? The first sword wasn't simply a bigger knife. It required humans to solve an entirely new engineering problem, one that had never existed before. And the strangest part is that the first swords weren't even made from the metal most people expect. Not steel. Not even bronze. Not at first. This is a story that starts with something far softer, far more fragile, and far less obviously capable of becoming a weapon at all. Long before anyone forged a sword, humans already carried weapons that had served them for generations. Stone blades, chipped and sharpened by hand, edges napped flake by flake until they could split flesh and bone. Wooden clubs, heavy and simple, requiring nothing more than strength and aim. Spears, extending reach beyond an arm's length, letting a hunter strike before an animal, or an enemy, ever got close. Axes, capable of cutting through wood and bone alike, doubling as both tool and weapon depending on the moment. And by the 4th millennium BCE, copper daggers entered the picture, short-bladed tools that archaeological research connects directly to advances in early copper metalworking. Each of these was already proven. Each of these already worked. The sword didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew directly out of all of this, out of thousands of years of humans slowly learning what a blade could do. So if humans already had daggers, sharp, functional, proven in use, why would anyone bother making a blade several times longer? The basic idea sounds almost embarrassingly simple. Take a familiar blade and make it longer. But that single change created a genuinely difficult new problem, one that no dagger maker had ever needed to think about. A short dagger can stay relatively rigid in the hand, resisting bending under normal use, because there simply isn't enough length for the metal to flex. A long blade behaves completely differently. Stretch that same metal out, and it becomes far more likely to bend, snap, or warp under the stress of impact, especially at the moment it matters most, in the middle of a strike. Length wasn't just a bigger version of the same object. It was a different engineering challenge entirely, one that would take generations to properly solve. Archaeological finds show humans were already experimenting with unusually long metal blades by the early Bronze Age. A copper sword recovered from Megiddo has been dated to roughly 3300 to 2900 BCE, and similarly early examples come from sites like Arslantepe, evidence that this experimentation wasn't confined to one isolated workshop or region, but was happening in more than one place, among people who likely never even knew of one another's existence. But before anyone could reliably make a long sword, they first had to learn how to control the metal itself. And that meant mastering something that, on its surface, looks almost like magic. This is where metallurgy enters the story. Somewhere, generations of trial and error taught early metalworkers to recognize copper-bearing ore, rock that looked ordinary to an untrained eye but held something else hidden inside it, something that could be coaxed out with enough heat and patience. That ore had to be gathered, then heated inside a furnace fed with charcoal, temperatures climbing high enough to coax the metal out of the stone surrounding it. Picture it happening in real time, someone crouched beside a glowing furnace, feeding it fuel, watching stone slowly change into something entirely different. Molten copper pooling at the base, ready to be poured into a waiting mold. That transformation, rock into liquid metal, was itself a genuine technological leap, long before anyone shaped it into a weapon at all. To someone who had never seen it before, it must have looked less like craftsmanship and more like something close to sorcery. But molten copper alone wasn't a sword. The real challenge came next, turning that metal into something with an actual blade, an edge sharp enough to matter and a shape balanced enough to use. Some of the earliest swords were made not from bronze, the alloy most people automatically associate with this era, but from copper or arsenical copper instead. The British Museum holds an early Bronze Age copper sword dated to roughly 2400 to 2000 BCE, direct physical proof that copper itself, not yet alloyed with anything else, was already being shaped into sword-length weapons. And the process behind that shaping is visible in the archaeological record too. A copper blade from Cyprus, dated to approximately 2300 to 1950 BCE, shows clear evidence of being cast, hammered, and annealed, meaning it was poured into shape inside a mold, worked and strengthened by repeated hammering along its length, then carefully reheated to relieve internal stress before being sharpened for use. Each of these steps had to be learned the hard way, through blades that cracked, warped, or shattered before the technique was finally understood. But copper had a real problem, one that no amount of skilled hammering could fully solve. It's a relatively soft metal, and a soft metal makes for an unreliable weapon, prone to bending exactly when you'd need it most, in the middle of impact against another blade or a shield. So how could something this soft ever become a blade you could actually trust in a fight? The next major breakthrough came from combining metals rather than simply working with copper alone. Craftsmen learned to alloy copper with tin, and that combination produced bronze, a material with genuinely different properties than either metal on its own, harder, more durable, and far better suited to holding an edge. This wasn't something discovered overnight in a single flash of insight. It came from accumulating knowledge across generations, understanding which ores produced usable copper, locating sources of tin, which was often far rarer and harder to find than copper itself, learning the right furnace temperatures for melting and combining two different metals, and gradually working out the correct proportions needed to alloy the two together successfully. The exact path toward this knowledge likely differed from one region to another, shaped by whatever ore and tin sources happened to be locally available, but the destination, once reached, changed what was actually possible. Bronze could be cast into more sophisticated shapes, and it held an edge, in its overall form, far more reliably than copper ever had. Now craftsmen could make longer, sturdier blades. But a sword isn't just a blade. There was still one problem left to solve, one that had nothing to do with metal at all. A blade without a secure handle is barely more useful than a sharpened rock. Ancient craftsmen had to figure out how to permanently and reliably join blade to grip, a connection that would need to survive the same repeated stress the blade itself did, the shock of impact traveling straight down into the hand holding it. Some Bronze Age swords solved this through riveted construction, separate cast components, blade and hilt, joined together using metal rivets driven through matching holes drilled with care. One Middle Bronze Age European sword, held today by the Met, is built from exactly this kind of two-piece construction, cast separately and then locked permanently together, tangs extended from the blade into the handle, anchoring the two pieces. Shoulders provided a stable transition point where blade met grip, spreading out the stress instead of concentrating it in one weak spot. Wood or other organic material wrapped around that core to form something a hand could actually hold and control, sometimes finished with a pommel at the base to balance the weapon and keep it from slipping free during use, even when the hand holding it was slick with sweat. Once blade and handle finally worked together as a single, dependable weapon, the sword became something considerably more than just a tool. It became a symbol. Owning a sword required real metal resources, specialized knowledge passed down through skilled craftsmen, and a significant amount of labor, none of it cheap, none of it available to just anyone. A farmer could carve a wooden club in an afternoon. A sword demanded ore, fuel, a furnace, a craftsman's years of training, and time that most people simply didn't have to spare. The Met notes that from their very emergence in the 3rd millennium BCE, swords functioned simultaneously as weapons and as symbols of social status and power. Burial sites reinforce this pattern clearly, swords treated not merely as practical tools left behind after death, but as valuable possessions worth carrying into the next world entirely, buried alongside their owners as though the afterlife itself might demand protection, or status, just as much as the world of the living did. But the first sword was only the beginning of this story. Once humans understood they could reliably make long metal blades, an even bigger question followed naturally. How good could a sword actually become? Over the centuries that followed, sword makers kept experimenting, refining what earlier generations had already established rather than starting over from nothing each time. Blades grew longer, shapes became more deliberate, more carefully balanced between weight and control, so a sword could be swung quickly without exhausting the arm holding it. Casting techniques and construction methods grew increasingly standardized and specialized as the craft matured, passed down through workshops rather than reinvented by every individual smith. Surviving Bronze Age examples from Britain range from considerably shorter blades all the way up to swords stretching between roughly 70 and 90 centimeters. A British Museum example weighing about 801 grams and demonstrating just how far sword making had advanced from those first tentative copper blades. And eventually, the underlying material itself would shift again entirely, opening the door to an entirely new age of weapons that lies beyond this particular story. The first sword wasn't a sudden invention, no single spark of genius, no one craftsman who simply decided to build a weapon unlike anything before it. It was the result of discovery after discovery, each one building directly on the last. Stone blades led to copper tools. Copper tools led to copper daggers. Daggers grew longer, forcing metalworkers to solve entirely new problems of strength and stability. Bronze solved what copper alone couldn't. Better construction solved what a blade alone couldn't. And step by step, across countless generations and, quite likely, across more than one region entirely independent of the others, all of that experimentation converged into something genuinely new, the specialized sword. The real invention here was never really the sword itself. It was the accumulated ability to control metal well enough to produce a blade that was long, strong, and reliable enough to actually survive combat. Today, making a sword can look almost effortless. Machines cut, grind, heat, and shape steel with a level of precision no ancient craftsman could have imagined, turning a process that once took a lifetime of accumulated skill into something a factory can repeat identically thousands of times over. But the people who made the very first swords had none of that. They had fire. They had stone pulled straight from the earth. They had metal, temperamental and difficult to master, that punished every mistake with a cracked or bent blade. They had patience, the kind measured across entire lifetimes rather than single afternoons. And they had generations of accumulated knowledge, passed carefully from one craftsman to the next, refined a little further with every attempt, every failure quietly teaching the next generation something the last one hadn't known. The sword may look like a simple piece of metal, but the first one represented something much bigger. The moment humans learned that with enough knowledge, even a piece of rock pulled from the ground could be transformed into a weapon,